All right. Well, if you're here for this risk management presentation. I'm certain you might have been through this before, but it never hurts as a refresher. Just a general reminder, what we talk about here is about the fraternity's policy, not necessarily the law per se. So obviously, if you have any questions that get to the legal nature, you'll want to talk to an attorney. We talk about this from the side of the fraternity. So a note about these slides, any text that you see kind of in this magenta color, those are all of my notes. Any text that you see that appears in black typeface will be an actual quote from the risk management policy itself. You can find the risk management policy online at apo.org. It's also, I think, included in the booklet that contains the bylaws, articles of association, standard chapter articles of association, and so on. All right, so to begin with, first, we have to ask why we have a formal risk management policy in the fraternity. So this is where I'll get a little bit of input from you two and ask you, why do we have this policy? Rick or Ashley, do you want to weigh in?
We try to have it to keep our students safe that we follow.
Okay. And Rick, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think it just creates an outline of some best practices of right here, things that we're doing to prevent harm to ourselves and others, and to really create like positive outcomes from every event or experience that we can.
Yeah, those are really good answers, and they really get at the reason why. It's to help us make sure that we are seeing to the safety, well-being, health, and dignity of all of our members, our prospective members, and guests at our events and functions. When we talk about events, we're talking about things like service projects and fellowship events, conferences and conventions, but obviously it can be broader than that. And also any of those things that people either come to participate in or they just come to observe. As well, if we think about our events as those things that a third party might say, well, that's an APO event, then our good risk management policy will help us will help us try to keep all of those important issues in mind. So good. Usually, one of the first answers I get is that we have this policy to protect us in the event of a lawsuit. The risk management policy is not going to do that. And I would suggest, and this is important for educating our members, if we are looking at the risk management policy to protect us from a lawsuit, we've missed the point of having the policy in the first place. The policy is to keep us safe, to keep our members and guests safe, to protect the reputation and good name of the fraternity. If we're thinking about it in terms of a lawsuit, we've missed all of that important stuff. So those other things are the important issues. What happens if there's a violation of the policy? And certainly both of you are section chairs. Hopefully your experience of having to deal with this will be very minimal, but in the event that it happens, there's a general process for this. First, if the issue is of an urgent or immediate issue that requires a response right away, which typically involves a threat to the life, health, or safety of an individual, you contact local authorities right away. 911, campus police, whatever. If somebody is in danger of harm, that's the first place you go. We have to make certain that their safety is addressed first. Then contact the chapter faculty advisor or a university official once that situation has stabilized, and then contact the region chair or the national office once that situation has stabilized. What we don't want our students to think is that, uh-oh, something's happened. The first thing I have to do is call my section chair. If somebody is lying on the ground injured and needs to go to a hospital, they need to get those people to the hospital first. They can do the notifications later. If it's not an urgent issue, it's something that has happened and they want to notify someone, they should contact the section chair, region chair, or national office via phone, and preferably in that order. once a student contacts the section chair, obviously the section chairs know who it is they need to talk to. They know the resources of where to go. And we want them to do that via phone, not via email. If they send you an email that says, hey, Ashley or Rick, can you call me right away about something urgent? That's one thing. But to the extent that we can, they should have those conversations with you over the phone. And then contacting the chapter faculty advisor or university official, telling them early and being upfront is generally far more important and better than waiting to the last minute and sort of after the fact telling them. When an allegation is made, it's going to be investigated by an appropriate fraternity official. It's also important to note that the university, once they find out, may choose to conduct their own investigation. Universities have handled this many different ways. Sometimes they allow the fraternity to do the investigation and just provide the university with a report of what our findings and actions were. And then sometimes the university will say, from the university perspective, that issue has been sufficiently addressed. Sometimes the university wants to do its own investigation. Sometimes it will look at what the fraternity did and decide it wants to go even further, or maybe it doesn't agree with the action the fraternity took. Maybe the fraternity took action, but the university thought it wasn't stringent enough and they want to take further action. So chapters need to be aware that even though this is a fraternity policy that we're talking about, the university very well may become involved. In any investigation by the legitimate authorities, we need every member of the chapter to fully cooperate, to be completely honest and forthright, and to not hide, conceal, or otherwise attempt to deceive the investigating authority. Having been in the position as the chair of the Committee of Spirit and Standards, I can tell you that chapters who hide or lie or try to obscure what happened, things tend to go far worse. And the reason is we usually find a lot there. And once we have reason to believe that there is more there, we will go look for it. The idea here is trying to keep our members safe. And when chapters are untruthful with us, it makes it harder for us to do that. All right, so we get into the guts of the policy itself, and for your own benefit, I'm not going to read all of these slides word for word. I'm certain you are familiar with them, but I do, I'll make reference to some of the specific language. For example, in this one, the slide about hazing, it defines what the fraternity considers to be hazing. But I've highlighted a provision here that is important because it provides context for the events that we are talking about. So any of these events that are listed below that are not okay or that fall into the hazing category, things like road trips and branding, quests, treasure hunts, scavenger hunts, and all those things. The important context is that those things are done. It's any action taken or situation created intentionally, whether on or off fraternity premises or during fraternity functions, to produce mental or physical discomfort, embarrassment, harassment, or ridicule. So for one of these prohibited activities to be categorized as hazing, it has to do one of those things, right? Some things are pretty obvious. Branding is branding. It is physically harming another. There is not a context under which branding would be okay. That in part is created to intentionally create physical discomfort or pain, right? But what about some of these other things that chapters sometimes do? First, to whom does this policy apply? It applies to every member of the fraternity, from a petitioner to a pledge, active, alumnus, fraternity, professional staff, volunteer alumni like us, members of the board of directors, and so on. Every single member must abide by this policy. I do hear the joke from time to time about, well, you can haze active members. No, you cannot. This policy protects every single member of the fraternity. It is not limited solely to protecting pledges. No member or potential member may be hazed. So, for example, let's talk about road trips. Can you take road trips? What do you guys think? Are road trips okay? They're on the prohibited list. Is it okay to take road trips? Anyone?
I would say, I think like, um, it's hard, right? Because I think to one's interpretation. But I'd say like if it's an optional, like right, if it's not something that's required and people can opt to, but then you just have to be conscious of like if there's pressure, you know what I mean, that you have to attend. Like it's a gray area, but I'd say I think you can say like, hey, I as an individual I'm going to this. Like, do you want to go with me? Is different than like we're planning something to.
Okay, let me ask Rick, what do you think is a road trip that you think under your kind of standard that you think would be permissible, would be okay?
Um, I'm going to the grocery store, or like for example, like where the chapter that I pledged would be like it was an hour and a half from like the closest city, and so we would like take road trips to go to like the mall. Like that was just like things that we did like together. That was like optional.
Okay.
I think that would be okay.
All right. Well, so the answer to the question, can you take road trips, depends. If it's voluntary, which is, Rick, was an important component of your kind of standard, yes. And if it serves a legitimate fraternity purpose, and if it complies with fraternity and university policies and law, then it's probably okay. For example, how else do you get to sectional or regional conferences, right? You drive. You usually get a handful of brothers in a car and you drive an hour or 2 hours, or in the case of a regional conference, a little bit longer. Depending where the national convention is, you might drive, right? So are road trips prohibited? Well, yes, if they meet the context that prohibits them in the risk management policy, right? So no, you don't get a blindfold pledges and throw them in a trunk of a car, drive them out to the middle of nowhere and dump them out and tell them to find their way home. That kind of road trip would not be okay. Okay. But saying, hey, we're taking 2 cars to go to the regional conference. You know, here's car 1 and car 2. I'm going to take 3 people, and Ashley's going to drive 5 people. She can get 5 people in her car. Everybody's got to wear a seatbelt. You've got to comply with all applicable laws. That type of road trip would probably be okay. It serves a legitimate fraternity purpose, and as long as it follows the policies of fraternity and your university and the law, probably is going to be okay. What about scavenger hunts? A lot of chapters have scavenger hunts, especially for pledges who are freshmen to help them learn about the campus or fraternity history. Are scavenger hunts okay? Ashley, what do you think about scavenger hunts?
I think as long as they're not forced and you're not forcing them to do anything illegal or going against anything, they're not bad. So
a little bit of history here. Chapters have done scavenger hunts kind of forever, right? And in one case, a pledge died as a result of an activity in a scavenger hunt, where the pledges were asked to go take a piece of property that did not belong to them from somebody's home. So scavenger hunts, for example, it's going to depend. Does it require that person or the people participating to take property that doesn't belong to them, or entering onto private property without permission? That probably wouldn't be okay. But let's say your chapter has an annual service project at a scout camp, right? And let's say as part of that project, one of the things you do is rehab or fix up maybe a footbridge or 2 that the chapter built in the past. So maybe as part of that scavenger hunt on the way to the service project, they take a picture of the bridge and then they work on it. That might be okay, right? So context under which it happens and the rules and policies that will govern that scavenger hunt are going to be important, right? Following the laws, making it voluntary. You don't do it in the dead of night, in the dead of winter where people can't see, and people aren't allowed to wear coats. You can't go into people's homes or in their property and take things. Those kinds of things would not be okay, right? The reason I bring these up is I've heard volunteers say, well, if you're going to get in a car ride, a car with 4 or 5 people and go to a conference, you can't call that a road trip. Well, it is a road trip. and people share rides to go to conferences. So context for these things is important. All right, the next major topic that the risk management policy addresses is sexual misconduct, right? Violence, rape, sexual violence, sexual exploitation, sexual harassment, sexual assault. We don't tolerate it in the fraternity. And it is important to note that everything listed in that list is a crime. So allegations of sexual misconduct as defined in this policy may well be reported to law enforcement. And in every case, in all cases, a member who feels that they have been the victim of such behavior must see to their own safety. And if they conclude, hey, this thing has happened to me, I need to call the police, then that is what they need to do, right? The chapter and its members cannot prevent an individual from contacting the police. If a person feels that they are a victim of one of these things and they feel that to protect themselves, they need to call the authorities, then that is precisely what they should do. Right? Yes, notifying the fraternity will be important in that, but notifying the fraternity does not substitute for notifying law enforcement if that victim believes that they are a victim of one of those acts. We also talk about discrimination in the fraternity. And as a general matter, we don't tolerate any form of abusive or discriminatory behavior on the part of its members for any reason. And then the fraternity lists, a handful of characteristics. Some are what we call immutable characteristics, those things about us that we cannot change. Some of them are not immutable, but of the things in this list here, what is important to note that none of the things in this list are characteristics, immutable or otherwise, that prevent someone from being a leader, being a friend, or from being of service. All persons have the ability to do those three things. And as a result, there's no place in the fraternity for discriminating against persons on the basis of any of those characteristics. It's also important to note that discrimination sometimes is not overt, right? It can be a small group of people in a chapter doing things kind of off to the side to make things harder or more difficult for an individual member. That would not be okay either. Now, excluding someone from membership because they failed to meet reasonable objective requirements for membership generally is not considered discrimination. For example, most chapters have requirements for pledging that deal with a minimum number of service hours during the time in which they pledge. That is a reasonable, objective standard. Did that person do the service hours or not? Now, the chapter can always say, well, but they didn't, but the reason they didn't do it was because X, Y, Z, so we're going to waive that requirement or whatever. Chapters certainly have that right? Or you might, have the chapter, or you might have pledges take tests or quizzes, right? So long as the tests and quizzes are fair and related to the period of pledgeship, right? And someone doesn't, meet the requirement, they don't pass enough of the quizzes or whatever, that can be a reasonable objective requirement as well. But all of these other things, there is nothing about being of a particular gender or any gender that prohibits someone from being a productive member of Alpha Phi Omega. There's nothing about anyone's particular religious affiliation that would prohibit them from doing so, right? So we do not tolerate discrimination, and when we find out, we try to move very quickly, keeping in mind, as I said earlier, that discrimination is not always overt, and so sometimes it takes a little bit of work to uncover it or find demonstrable evidence of it. Contractual and financial issues. This is one that our chapters often get on the wrong side of and don't realize they've done it. No chapter or any entity in the fraternity, with the exception of the national office and the national executive director, can enter into any contract or financial agreement using the name of Alpha Phi Omega. If a chapter wants to enter into a contract using the name of Alpha Phi Omega, they must also include the chapter name. And they have to do it for any such thing as leases, contracts, hold harmless agreements, liability releases, account agreements, purchase order, and hotel or banquet contracts. So what's that all mean? Any sort of contract, agreement, or terms of service. And this is the one where our chapters usually don't comply, but again, it's usually completely unintentional. But any of those things to which the chapter is a party may not use the name of Alpha Phi Omega solely. They must also include the name of the chapter. This will include contracts, agreements, or terms of service, rental agreements for banquets, bank accounts, catering services, and the big one, social media accounts. If your chapter has a Facebook account, Skype or Zoom account, Instagram, TikTok, any of those, all of which require you to agree to the terms of service, all of those names of Alpha Phi Omega must be qualified with the chapter specific name as well. Alcohol and drugs and substance abuse. We don't tolerate the illegal use of alcohol. We certainly don't tolerate the use of illegal drugs. And it's important to note that there are some drugs, for example, marijuana, that some states have said it's legal within the state, but it is still illegal under federal law. So this policy essentially says when it comes to alcohol, and let's be honest, it's typically the one that we encounter most often in the fraternity, that the use of alcohol must comply with any legal requirement for that alcohol. You know, anybody consuming must be 21 or older. It cannot be used in connection or conjunction with membership or recruitment or pledge or new member education programs. It can't have anything to do with those. And violation of this policy is considered a violation of the membership policies of Alpha Phi Omega, which makes it actionable by the fraternity. So we get asked this a lot. Is Alpha Phi Omega a dry fraternity? In other words, does APO prohibit alcohol at any fraternity event? Rick, what do you think? What's the answer to that question?
It's technically, well, it's more like damp, I would say, is like maybe a great descriptor. And it just, and while it's a unique experience because my chapter was a dry chapter because of our campus policies. And so I think it just really, like, the campus is going to supersede sort of what that expectation usually looks like. But I mean, and the law trumps that as well. So it just depends from campus to campus. But usually it's, alcohol is just for people who are legal, like of legal age, and it usually has to be served in a separate room.
So the short answer here is the fraternity of Alpha Phi Omega is not a dry fraternity. In other words, we don't prohibit alcohol in all circumstances at all times. Alcohol is prohibited in some circumstances. The use or presence of alcohol may not be made a requirement, either explicit or implicit, for membership or any other standing within the fraternity. For example, if you have an event at which there will be alcohol and you have pledges, you cannot require them to attend that event, period, right? Because doing so, if you say, hey, all pledges must come to the, fall banquet following their initiation, right? Well, if you're going to have alcohol at that event, you're requiring members to be, as a condition of their membership generally, to be at an event where alcohol is served, even if you don't expect them to drink. It becomes a requirement for membership, so that's not okay. If you do have alcohol at an event, that event must comply with all applicable laws and ordinances, university and fraternity policy. So even though the fraternity might say, hey, we don't prohibit the legal use of alcohol, Rick, in your case, your university says student organizations may not have alcohol at their events. And because that policy is stricter than fraternity policy, then we would defer to the university policy in that case. Doesn't matter what the fraternity says in that particular case, the university has a stricter requirement. And I apologize if you hear the cat yelling in the background. Also, you may not use chapter funds to pay for alcohol. Now, what are chapter funds? Well, obviously, chapter funds are any money that goes into the chapter's bank account and comes out of that account. It passes through that account. But chapter funds, that phrase also has been deemed to include money that goes through the control or into the hands of any person that is acting on behalf or of the chapter or acting for the chapter. For example, chapter decides it wants to have an event at which there will be alcohol. It knows it can't use chapter funds to pay for that alcohol. So it decides, oh, well, instead of, writing a check or give your money to the treasurer, give money to so-and-so, and then they're going to go out and buy all the alcohol. That's not okay either. That's trying to use kind of a loophole to get around the prohibition. So chapter funds typically includes anybody. It also includes going into the control of anybody that's acting for or on behalf of the chapter. And when I say it can't be made a requirement, either explicit or implicit, obviously explicit would be you must attend this event, right, at which there's going to be alcohol. That's an explicit. Implicit could be something along the lines of, well, you don't have to go, but it would really look good if you did. That would be an implicit requirement, right? If a pledge were to tell you, I know they tell us we don't have to go, but they kind of make me feel like I do, that tells you you've got a problem, okay? Personal property. This is a pretty simple concept. People in APO volunteer their property for all kinds of stuff, right? You might volunteer your apartment or your home for, the chapter to come over. Let's say you're going to participate in homecoming. So you're going to have people come over and make banners, for example, right? Well, if something happens to your personal property, you don't get to hold the fraternity liable for that. The fraternity, this policy specifically says that the fraternity does not assume liability for that, right? So if everybody comes to my house to make banners and Brother Joe knocks a gallon of paint over and ruins my carpet, I can hold him accountable, right? I can go after him to make him pay for the damages or whatever, but I cannot go after the fraternity. So anytime any one of us volunteers any of our property for use in conjunction with fraternity activities, I assume the responsibility for that, not the fraternity. It's sort of like, hey, this was a risk I took. I knowingly took it. And I covered this part. Transportation issues. We talked about this a little bit early, but again, a pretty straightforward concept. When it comes to using your vehicle for an event, you're driving people, to an event, you're going to pick up decorations for, your banquet, whatever. Any person who drives or otherwise provides transportation in conjunction with activities must obey by the law, especially those concerning vehicle safety, vehicle operations such as speed limits and so on, consumption of alcoholic beverages. If you rent a vehicle, you do so in accordance with the rental contracts. If you use your car and something happens to it, that's on you. If you get into a car accident and it's somebody else's fault, again, you hold them accountable, not the fraternity. You use seat belts. I think seat belts are required pretty much in all 50 states. And most states have a requirement, something along the lines of you can't have more people in the vehicle than there are a number of seat belts or safety restraints. Driver must be licensed and insured, no impaired driving, and so on. General health and safety. Any activity shall take into account the health and safety of all participants. That's going to include things like the use of personal safety equipment. If you're out doing Adopt a Highway, making certain that people have like the orange or yellow safety vests so that they can be seen. If you go to a Habitat for Humanity project, for example, as many chapters do, and you're using tools, power tools, regular tools, instruction in the safe and proper use of those things. Those are all important. In addition to those things, though, no member of the fraternity, no chapter may prevent people from taking care of basic biological functions, eating, sleeping, using the restroom, taking medicine, etc. And what that means is, we often have, I was at a planning session with the chapter, I don't know, 15 years ago, and it's now called CAPS, but at the time it was the Chapter Program Planning Conference, the CPPC. And this particular chapter, they were sort of, I was at a chapter meeting, they were talking about the event coming up, and they said, we're starting on Friday night, and nobody goes to bed until we finish like these 3 areas. And I had to tell them, no, you can't do that. If a member is tired and wants to go to sleep, they go to sleep, right? It is why oftentimes if you were ever to attend a board of directors meeting of the fraternity or a long chapter meeting or something, someone might talk about a health and safety break. That's generally an opportunity for people to get up, to stretch their legs, to use the bathroom, and so on. Chapters may not prevent people or hold them accountable or discipline them for doing those things. At a national convention, this year obviously will be different, but at a national convention, one of the rules is that voting delegates must remain in their seats at all times. So what people have interpreted that to mean is that, well, that means that person can't get up and go to the bathroom unless, there's a recess. That's not true. What it means is that you can't just stand up and stand around and talk. If you need to go to the bathroom, you get up, you go to the bathroom, and then you come back, right? The fraternity would never stop somebody from doing that. As well, and I mentioned this earlier, but chapters are required to abide by university policies when the policies are stricter than fraternity policies. So particularly if you're doing a new event and you're not certain what the campus policies are, find those out. Advisors, I have been an advisor. Ashley, I think, weren't you or aren't you an advisor? I think you were at one point.
Yeah, I'm an advisor at Kent.
Okay. And Rick, have you or are you an advisor?
I'm going to be the advisor for our extension effort.
Okay.
But we're not quite there yet.
Okay, no, that's okay. So advisors have a special role. One of the things that the fraternity requires is that advisors recognize the duly elected or appointed officers of the chapter. Advisors don't generally have some special authority to say, ignore the chapter president. Right now, they may have responsibilities if they are there. For example, I was a faculty advisor to the chapter at IUPUI. Obviously, the university that employed me may have certain requirements for me in my role as an advisor to a student organization. That role generally trumps whatever policy the fraternity has, right? This is all to say that while advisors have to recognize the duly elected appointed officers, we're also bound by fraternity policy. They are to report violations of the risk management policy. They may be required by their employer to report such incidents to the university itself. The requirement for advisors to acknowledge the authority of a chapter's officers does not outweigh their other responsibilities. So a chapter president cannot tell their faculty advisor, hey, under this policy, you have to recognize my authority as chapter president, and I'm telling you, you're not allowed to discuss this with the university. A faculty advisor is likely going to have to report it, right? But as a general matter, what this gets at is that advisors do not run chapters. They are there to advise. They are there to provide guidance based in part on their knowledge of fraternity policy, but also based on their own experiences as well, right? So we, as advisors, we want to help keep our chapters out of trouble. We do our best to do that by advice, and hopefully the chapter makes good decisions and it never becomes an issue. But if it becomes an issue, then an advisor has, a responsibility to act. The education is a basic policy statement that annually every member of the fraternity is to be instructed on the risk management policy, which is why you see this type of workshop done at virtually every conference. I think it is why the Region H chair has asked that I record this so it can be made available to members who weren't able to participate today. Now, how a chapter chooses to instruct its members is certainly up to them. It must occur. And every year, as you know, having looked at the annual charter reaffirmations, right, that chapter presidents and advisory chairs are required to certify that the chapter is in compliance with the risk management, should say policies, not police. So I need to fix that. But with the risk management policies, which includes this education requirement, right? Some chapters provide a copy of the policy to their members every year, and they make each member sign a statement that they've received it. And here's a little hint. If a member does not sign such a statement, the policy still binds them anyway. So if you're going to sign an acknowledgement, or you're going to be bound by the policy, you should know it. I'm not certain that merely giving people a copy of the policy is really sufficient for educational purposes. Having some conversation about the components of the policy generally is, I think, is preferable. Now, the new slide I added sort of at the last minute, which is risk management in the age of COVID, because as you know, most of our chapters are meeting remotely. I think there are some chapters that are able to meet in person, but there is one chapter I'm aware of that has hundreds and hundreds of members, like 300, 400, 500 members. I don't know how a chapter like that could potentially meet in person and still social distance. So some special things to take into account. If chapters are going to meet over Zoom, Skype, or other electronic means, make certain it's got a password to log in. If it has a waiting room feature like Zoom does, make certain that that is used so people can't just pop in. Make certain that the moderator has, that whatever software used, the moderator has the ability to mute or cut off video from others and kick people from the meeting. You don't want people getting on and, who have nothing to do with the meeting or the group and, flashing somebody or whatever. That happened in my high school seniors class during the first week of school. So we want to make certain that if we're going to meet online, that we do our best to protect our members from people engaging in that sort of behavior. As well, if the chapter is going to have physical meetings or events, which some universities may allow, then the chapter needs to be familiar with the university's policies on such meetings and must comply with them, right? Which is probably going to involve social distancing, wearing masks, and so on. Hand sanitizer for people at the events and whatnot. So as long as we are living in this new environment, we have a special layer of risk management that we have to take into account. Now, I'm going to ask if either of you have questions, but before I do, a couple of important disclaimers. One, if you ask a question, any advice I give you is based solely on what it is you tell me, which is going to be relatively limited. As such, if a real situation were to exist, the facts and circumstances surrounding that specific event will ultimately be used in determining whether or not a violation has occurred. Second, and this was advice that I got from Maggie Katz when Maggie was the Region 6 director and I was a chapter president at the time. And that is, if you're planning an activity and you are unsure whether it complies with the fraternity policy, a good rule of thumb is if you have to ask if it's okay, it probably isn't, right? So that sort of general rule of thumb can go a long, long way to helping people go, it may not technically be a violation, but maybe it's not a good idea. So with that, with those two kind of disclaimers out of the way, are there any questions that you have that I could try to answer for you?
You sort of touched on this a little bit earlier, but what would you say are the best practices in terms of education for risk management that you've seen from your experience?
So I find that things like this, which is just sort of, we're just going to go over each kind of big major part of the risk management policy, is very helpful. In part because there are things that people don't ordinarily think of, right? So let's say a chapter decides we're going to create a VP of communications position, right? And the person who gets elected or appointed to that role decides, you know what, we're going to do, we're going to have our own Facebook page, and we're going to have Instagram, and we're going to do TikTok. We're going to tie it all together, and we're going to use it for recruitment and whatever, right? Well, if they don't know that they also, when they agree to that, they have to use the chapter specific name, then they're just going to enter it in the name of Alpha Phi Omega, which they technically cannot do, right? So usually for me, I find that just kind of the general conversation about the policy's major parts and understanding why we have it. The purpose of the policy is important to understanding, right? And there's a lot of misunderstanding about the policy, about the fraternity doesn't allow X, it doesn't allow Y. Well, that's not really true. And I would much rather be honest with our members about what the policy does and does not prohibit versus just letting them think that something is prohibited. So does that answer your question, Rick?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
You're welcome. Ashley, do you have any questions?
I don't. I'm good.
Okay. Well, if you have nothing else, that is all that I have. This presentation is, I'm going to stop the recording here in a minute. It'll be saved to the cloud, and then Brittany, I guess, will make it available. So if you have no other questions, thanks for joining me on a Saturday afternoon.
Well, thanks for coming out and doing this on a Saturday for us.
Hey.
We appreciate it.
I didn't have to leave my dining room, so it's all good. And maybe I'll see you guys online at the convention. If not, I don't know when I will see either of you in person again. So be safe. And obviously, if you have any questions, you can always shoot me an email. That's okay too.
Thanks, Mark. Have a great
right.
day.
Hey, you too. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.